very much, Charlotte, for having
pleasure.
us today at Westminster House. It's
Absolute pleasure.
Beautiful venue for us to come to, and a real
you.
pleasure to have you on today.
Thank you.
Besides you being a phenomenal person in your own right, but you're not only the first female High Commissioner to Mauritius from Britain, but also you've got Mauritian roots. Were you actually born here?
So I was born here. My parents left Mauritius just before independence and settled in the UK.
Wow.
And then they came back to Mauritius for a little bit of time, and I was born here and then went back to London. So yeah, no, it's lovely to sort of, come back and get to know the island a little bit more, because I think, it would be arrogant to think that you arrive and you know absolutely everything just because your family are from here. And I think it's been really important for me, particularly in the first year of my role, because now I'm in my second year, to take the time and show the respect and learn. So, particularly with help from my colleagues in the High Commission, my local colleagues, getting out there, getting outside Port Louis, going to the south, going to the east, and just taking some time to really understand the island and the culture.
What's your favorite Mauritian dish?
Now,
I'm putting you on the spot here.
I'm gonna really, you're gonna be like, what? But I can't,
Try.
it ranges from, a really good dal pourri to, I have to say, rougail corned beef.
All right.
Yeah. Rougail corned beef, l'antinois, du riz. I'm very, very happy.
I'm with you on this one.
I know, hold the corned beef.
I know my husband's just offended by it, but I love it.
Yeah, the tinned corned beef thing, but maybe I'm sure they make it
Shannon,
very
don't worry.
here,
I absolutely understand. I know, it just feels wrong. It feels really wrong, but it's so right.
I totally get you. I'm glad that we're on the same page here. Now, Charlotte, the topic for our podcast is happiness.
Okay.
And we wanted to meet with you and discuss just how the UK does things in terms of happiness. Now, happiness has woven itself into political discourse and political debates over the last few years. And in fact, I remember in 2011, I was in the UK, I was working there at the time, and the UK Prime Minister, David Cameron at the time, he had this speech and said that actually GDP on its own is an incomplete way of assessing a country's progress. And in fact, he went further and said that he wanted the Office for National Statistics to devise a way of measuring happiness.
Yeah.
I mean, I was intrigued because before that I thought, well, happiness is a personal thing, right? I mean, what's so special? What is so important about happiness that it has to make its way on the agenda of the British government?
That's a really big question. I mean, I think there's something about government is responsible or plays a massive and active role in the well-being and the welfare of citizens. And I think happiness is a part of that. And certainly what we've seen in the UK is an increasingly more visible and tangible conversation about mental health. Because, sort of mental health pervades everything you do. So I absolutely understand why happiness is seen as a part of, sort of economic success. Because if you're happy, it means your mental health is strong. It means, sort of naturally it leads to greater productivity and more positive economic activity. But I think that focus on its relationship with well-being and welfare is really important. And that in turn translates into, I think, really important government social policies. So health, education, that's really important. And getting good policies in health and education also translates to individual happiness. If you're well educated and you're healthy, naturally you're going to feel better. So I can absolutely see why, our government take it quite seriously.
Well, mental health is certainly linked to happiness. And I had a statistic that across the world a staggering 25 to 30% of people are registering issues around their mental health at work. And I just leading to sickness and absences and all of that kind of stuff, particularly in young people. How important do you think it is for the government to intervene on that?
So I think I view it as a building block to welfare and well-being. And I do believe that government and institutions have a role to play on that and have a responsibility to promote and ensure good welfare and good well-being. And happiness is an intrinsic part of that.
What are some of the policies that the UK have implemented that have had a positive effect on mental health and well-being in work?
So I sort of just referring back to something I said at the top, I think just promoting this idea that it's important to talk about mental well-being has been really important. I joined the workforce in the year 2000. I was 23, and the idea that you could talk about your mental well-being at work, when I started work, is just like, it blows my mind to where we are today. And it's interesting because I think it, as well as, as an employee, I'm an employee as well, with my boss, I'll talk about my objectives, I'll talk about what I'm delivering, but then my boss will also be interested about how I'm feeling. And that's massively motivational. And I think it also encourages employee loyalty. And, I think if you've got motivation in the workplace, you've got a sense of belonging, you've got a sense of loyalty, people are more likely to be productive and want to work harder.
Yeah.
So I think that focus on, sort of happiness, mental health has really been driven in the UK, both in the public sector, but also in the private sector. And that's not just an altruistic thing. I think it's a productivity and business efficiency thing as well.
So is it like raising the awareness that's coming from the top, from the government, about mental health, normalizing things, and making people talk more about it? Is that what it is?
I think so. And I think, we see sort of senior figures in the UK being open about moments where they've struggled with their mental health issues. Certainly past prime ministers have been in a really difficult situation, for example, where they've lost children, and they've spoken about it. And I think what's really important, though, at the same time is, like contrived conversations and forcing people. I think, you're more authentic when you're at your kind of natural level of being open about your mental health. But absolutely, we've seen over the past, certainly sort of 10, 15 years, senior figures in government, in business, being open about when they felt vulnerable. And that's been really important, I think.
Yeah, in the UK, I know that conciliation is a big thing because conflicts at work, is a major source of unhappiness really for a lot of people. And so before you go to an employment tribunal, for example, you would be channeled towards ACAS for early conciliation.
So I think formally, I don't have the kind of the full verbal on the roles of, sort of ACAS but I think every employer, the rules and regulations mean that before you get to a certain point of moving to a tribunal, you have to involve some kind of mediation. But I don't have the kind of the full 101 on that.
No, just from what you have seen and experienced.
I've been really lucky not to have been taken. Have you? But my understanding is that, before you get to formal, to a formal tribunal, you have to go through mediation.
Do you really feel this is, a good way of resolving issues and avoiding, escalation of matters at work?
I think so. I think mediation is so important. It's important in any conflict, whether it's professional or anything else. And often when you get to that point where you're thinking about sort of tribunals, it's probably because there's been a total breakdown of communication. And, resolving conflict is all about communication. So I think mediation is massively important because it allows someone that's independent, not on either side, to get involved and actually restore the communication between the two sides. Trying to get each side to understand the other's perspective can only really happen through an independent third party. I think that's really important. So I think conciliation is mediation. I'd call it mediation. I think is so important.
Yeah, I love how it also takes off the pressure from the legal system or the courts. And I mean, yeah, they're busy enough with.
I mean, as soon as something gets legal, it gets really difficult.
Yeah.
And I think people, sort of different parties' ability to be flexible and to be open to, sort of really thinking about their position and thinking about if there's any flexibility in their position gets really difficult. So I think it's a really important, they play a really important role.
Okay. So I've heard of this amazing trial about when we go to the idea of working hours of the working week.
Yeah.
And there was this amazing 4-day working week trial that the UK has done. It's just finished in March 2023.
Okay.
And it undoubtedly showed all of this amazing results of like people feeling really great, working 4 days in that week rather than 5. Advocates are saying that having a shorter work week improves the work-life balance, obviously. But clearly there's a flip side then for employers or manufacturers and things, having a shorter time frame or to be able to produce their goods to sell, or whether it be the employers needing to hire more staff to work, sort of a shift system, I'm guessing. What are your thoughts around that?
So this is a really interesting question. I'm not aware of the trial, so I can't speak to the actual sort of outcomes or the data of it. But so I'll speak just, I guess, sort of personally from the concept of it. I think this kind of sense of flexibility about work is really important, because we're a really different society now, to when it was, kind of a man going out to work and his partner would stay at home and look after the kids if they had them and whatever. It's a totally different environment. And I think employers have to remain responsive and agile to the way that society is changing. I do think it's quite industry specific. And I think, it's particularly sort of Scandinavian countries, they are quite sort of, probably a bit further ahead to the rest of us about sort of flexible work patterns and working differently. But I would sort of pause about industry specificity. So for example, law enforcement, they already work shift patterns. My sister's a police officer, she works crazy shifts and whatnot. But, would they necessarily have the numbers of police officers to be able to work a 4-day shift? I don't know. So I think we absolutely have to roll with the society we have. Families are constituted in a different way. People expect to work in a different way. COVID forced us to work in a different way. And I think, as institutions and employers, we should be responsive to that and really challenge ourselves to maximise productivity and welfare. But I think there has to be always thinking about, will it work for my industry? Can it work? And I think particularly the law enforcement one makes me take pause. But there's no reason why it can't. It just has to be really thought about quite carefully.
We don't know whether in education that will work. Can you imagine kids being at school for just 4 days a week?
I think they would love it.
Yeah, they would, but I want them at
well.
school more.
As a parent.
7-day week. 7 days school week, please.
Pay. I want to talk to you about pay, because pay is big, in terms of sources of happiness at work, etc. Or maybe not, because pay is not everything at the end of the day. But how does the UK view pay in terms of whether we should be more controlling, dictating what the terms should be between the employer and the employee? I've seen that there is not as much control as in countries like, for example, in Mauritius. Okay. Why do you think that is?
So I'll talk about what I understand on the UK side, and this is probably more as as a British person rather than in terms of government policy. We've got the minimum wage, and I think there's something really important about ensuring and protecting employee rights, because, a fair wage for a fair work, for a fair day's work, absolutely. And I think that is really important in the context of protecting people's rights. Having said that, I think it is it's something that involves different stakeholders. I think government has to have the right legislation and enabling environment to make sure that pay is fair, and that, you know, sort of on the rights point. But also it's a conversation for businesses to make sure that they are, you know, sort of they are still competitive and the UK remains competitive. And then also with trade unions, you know, sort of making sure that people's individuals and collective rights are respected. So I think for us in the UK, it's not about one person setting it, it's about making sure that the right stakeholders are involved in setting it. And I think we do that. I think there is a productive partnership between government, business, trade unions. I think that is productive, and it, you know, it's evolved over time. I think also though, like, it's interesting to talk about pay and happiness, because I think the more you are paid, the more you have the ability to think about your happiness. I think people, you know, particularly sort of middle classes, you have time to think about, am I happy? Yep. I think when you're on a low income, you know, just feeding your kids and clothing your kids is probably,
you're too busy to
you're
even
too busy
think about
thinking about that. So I think, you know, on the pay point, it is a conversation that involves different stakeholders, and I think rightly so. But I think, you know, especially if you're on a lower income, that, you know, you're so focused on getting through things that the kind of wider happiness thing probably is secondary.
I read a piece of research actually that said that in the UK, any pound that you earn over £10,000 has a marginal benefit which is less than the actual cost of earning it.
Okay.
So anyway, it's very economic. So excuse my background.
No, absolutely.
Yeah,
Very
but that was
important.
interesting, because at the end of the day, pay is not everything. But I agree with you. I think there are other elements that the government really looks out for in the UK, that make sure that the employers do look after their employees, and mental health is one of them.
Yeah, I mean, sort of health and safety at work is so important, and obviously it links to well-being and welfare, but just making sure that the right standards, you know, that there is no underage work occurring. That's absolutely the role of, you know, government has to play an enforcement role in that and set the standard. But again, it has to be a partnership between the right stakeholders. So that's employees as individuals, or if they're part of a trade union, but with business as well, and with government, all working together.
Yeah. So fair treatment at work, it's something that we've been discussing just now. I mean, it flows naturally into the next topic, which is about quotas and, you know, gender representation, disability, you know, and all that kind of stuff. Where do you stand on this? Because recently I've heard you speak, I think it was an interview, where you said you don't believe in quotas. And I thought that was very interesting, because I also don't. Can you maybe elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is a really important topic, because it's about how do you kind of force change. And I don't know if it's necessarily a conversation about quotas. For me, it's a conversation about intervention. I absolutely believe you have to intervene. You have to do something. You can't just kind of let the sort of, you know, sort of natural cycle of the world, you know, deliver diversity and inclusion. It doesn't work that way. But I think a really interesting example I would use is that the UK government, in the G7 countries, all the ambassadors are female. And that's not an accident. That is because around sort of 25 years ago, the UK government took an active decision to develop a pipeline of female talent. So that is, you know, 25 years ago, someone having the like, oh, you know, we need greater female representation. Let's do something about it. So I probably believe more in intervening and being interventionist rather than quotas, because you can create any quota you like, you can create any KPI you like, but if you don't have the infrastructure underneath to deliver it, you're never going to achieve it. And I think also the conversation around quotas can be quite negative, because, you know, there is something really important to me about merit. And I think we all share that view that, you know, you must be able to do a job effectively if you are given that job. And that's really important to me, because I think it can have such a negative impact if people think that someone is in a job because of what they look like or where they went to school or whatever, that's just reinforcing, sort of exclusion. And I think it really takes us back. So merit and having an infrastructure for diversity and inclusion is really important. And I think, that people expect diversity to just happen, and I think you need to invest in it over time. And I would go back to my illustration around, we now have all our senior ambassadors in G7 countries are female.
That's
So it
really
works.
awesome, yeah.
It just takes time.
And forward planning, and
Exactly.
I love that,
You have to intervene. You have to create a structure to deliver the diversity you want. It doesn't just happen.
Interesting that you say that sometimes it has to be intended an intervention to make it work. I don't know if it was intended or not, but the UK has had 3 female prime ministers. You've had Margaret Thatcher, you've had Liz Truss recently, but before that, Theresa May. And also you've had a coloured prime minister, another Rishi. And I don't know whether, again, if it was intended to be that way, but certainly the fact that the government is already diverse, they lead by example. It sends a message to the community, to workers and employers, about the need for diversity. Do you feel that this is something that should happen in Mauritius and can happen in Mauritius, or do you feel that we still got a way to go?
So, I'll probably just focus on the UK on this one, because the appointments of the figures you've identified, they were political, so I can't really comment on that bit. But what I can say is that we absolutely celebrate them. I think we celebrate the fact that we have had diverse leadership in the UK. But I still do believe that those people were appointed on merit. They went through a selection process. They had to make their case. It wasn't just because they were a certain demographic that they got such a senior role. So, I think absolutely those jobs were secured on merit, but we should absolutely celebrate the fact that they have them. So yeah, that's probably what I say. And I think it's possible everywhere. I don't see why not. And I don't see why not.
But don't you think it's also depending on the mindset
The environment.
of the people?
I do,
of the
and
environment?
absolutely. And I think this is why, I'm a firm believer that the UK is a modern, diverse society. Yes, we have a long way to go, of course, still.
Probably like what you were saying before about it takes a decision to open it to being like we're going to, for want of a better word, groom female or different ethnicity talent.
For the fact that you have the son of Indian immigrants as Prime Minister, you have the daughter of Mauritian immigrants as British High Commissioner, it shows that we have a good, strong, progressive, enabling environment for talent from different parts of society to feel like they are included and they can have the confidence to go for what they want. Absolutely, like I said before, we still have a long way to go. We absolutely still do. But I think the last 20 to 30 years have demonstrated that the UK is walking the talk and its institutions are absolutely opening up.
And I think it's a matter of time as well.
Yeah.
And like when I studied in the UK, which was over 20 years ago now, I don't think that people would have understood, okay, one day there will be, or maybe in the near future, there will be a coloured prime minister in the UK. But, in the last 10 years, I think this is now normal. No one is like, oh, how come, Rishi Sunak is the prime minister? It's like, well, he deserves it and he's in the right place.
Absolutely. So for our prime minister, for me, it's, he was chosen by the party because he was the best candidate for the job, not necessarily because he was a person of colour. And I do think that is how we think in the UK. We still absolutely, focus, in a laser-like fashion on ability and merit, but at the same time, we want our countries to reflect, we want our institutions and government and business to reflect society of modern Britain. And that is a diverse society. Our favourite food is a curry, and Afrobeat from Nigeria and South Africa tops our music charts.
And we have Queen Charlotte, who's a black lady.
Well, Netflix, absolutely. But, you know, I'm a strong believer that, you know, as I said, we've still got a long way to go, but we are absolutely going in the right direction.
So aside of the politics, what do you feel that corporates, you know, what measures could they implement that you think would prove positive in creating happiness for individuals, for their employees at home? Like, what are some of the measures that corporates in the UK take?
So, I mean, I think I work in sort of the public sector, and my experience is probably more detailed on that side of the house. I think we do, it comes back to something I said earlier about just recognising that societies evolve and you have to evolve with them. Being responsive, being agile, and understanding that your work structure and your work practices have to just keep on changing to a point. You know, on the kind of the gender side, and, you know, I think the fact that families are different now, blended families, single parent families, I think work practices have to adjust to that. You know, it's not the same of, you know, someone who has a family but might necessarily be bringing up their kids on their own can't do, you know, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. They might need a different way of working. So I think just being responsive and being agile and, you know, sort of keeping pace with the way society is evolving is really important if you want to, you know, sort of maximise productivity. I think the other thing is not shying away from difficult topics. So again, going back to the sort of gender dimension, one of the issues was trying to retain women who were having children, you know, and sort of very simple but effective measures, like, for example, talking about breastfeeding and having, you know, sort of the infrastructure to allow women, you know, sort of mothers with younger children and babies to still express at work and have a safe space for them to do that, but come back to work, you know, is really important. And you can just see for some of the, you know, so for some people, those topics like, oh God, breastfeeding, oh, I don't want to talk about it. But you have to, because that's just part of life. So not shying away from topics that, you know, that are a bit uncomfortable for some people, you have to, because that's how you create the infrastructure to, for example, allow working mothers to come back, and you then don't lose that talent that you've probably invested in for the last 10 years. You don't need it. So it's an efficiency and, you know, a financial decision as well as the right thing to do. And I think what I'm really loving that certainly in the public sector, so for example, we're now talking about menopause. And, you know, in Mauritius, I've mentioned the word menopause a couple of times and people are like, oh! But, you know, women of my age, you know, sort of early to mid 40s, were perimenopausal, and it's affecting our ability to work. And so let's talk about it, and let's, you know, rather than sort of women, you know, sort of not performing and not feeling supported at work, why lose that talent? I have, you know, a number of friends who are in senior roles who were struggling until they were able to talk about these issues with their line management. And what you don't want is to lose that talent, either because they leave because they feel it's too much and they haven't got support, or they lose their confidence. So I think the other thing I say is be willing to talk about the subjects that are a little bit uncomfortable, because that's how you retain talent.
Yeah. Something in the corporate world, in fact, recently, Lord Price, Mark Price, who was the former Minister of Trade in the UK, he said something. He said that in the UK, people, on average, they thank someone for doing something right once every 3.5 months, but they criticize twice a week. And I mean, the culture of encouragement has kind of been maybe forgotten, I don't know, but do you feel like this is something that's super important to create happiness at work.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm really surprised by that statistic. I'm
I
not sure, but yeah, I'm not sure
don't know
about
where
it.
his research comes from.
Certainly, you know, I think certainly in my sector and in my in sort of the civil service, there is a big sort of like culture of appreciation, because it then just comes back to sort of basic human interaction. That if you've done a good job, you should just be, you know, someone should just say thank you. It's just the right thing to do, but also it's so intrinsically linked to motivation and, you know, sort of wanting to do a good job. And we do have, you know, there is a big push within certainly my institution to make sure that people feel valued. So the quality of their job, but also when they do a great job, you have to value that and you have to acknowledge it. And we absolutely do that. There's also the balance of, you know, managing performance as well, and we don't shy away from that. But there is absolutely a way of, you know, of being motivational, but then also the driving for high standards and performance. I think that you can absolutely do both, and we do both.
So, because you're a boss yourself, you're a manager, you have people that you have to manage. How do you balance, I know you talked about it, but how do you actually balance giving praise with actually giving probably not so positive feedback because you've seen something which someone has done wrong and you need to address?
I think you can always give feedback. You know, I mean, it's a bit sort of contrived, but constructive criticism is the way to do feedback. You know, to sort of, I mean, absolutely, there are moments when everyone's really super stressed, you know, something goes wrong and you have to take quite a directive tone. You have to be like, that's wrong, please correct it. You know, but you have to adjust the way you do feedback. You have to read the room and say, you know, this is how, and flex your style, basically. And every manager has a spectrum of style that ranges from supportive and understanding and nurturing to directive, to, oh, look, there's a car driving at me, I'd better get out of the way. You know, there's a spectrum. So I think when giving, you know, feedback, you have to sort of understand where are you on that spectrum of you as a manager. I think also, you know, in terms of constructive feedback, you have to then think about, okay, I'm going to give this person this piece of feedback. How are they going to respond? And how am I going to help them, you know, sort of address it? So I think, you know, to say, you know, for example, this piece of work was written really badly, the end, is not the way to do it. This piece of work, you know, what you needed to improve was A, B, and C. You had the basics right, and this is how I'm going to help you get better. There, of course, gets to a point where you've done all of that, you've gone through your whole toolkit, where you've thought about how you're giving, you know, the style you're giving feedback, you've tried to put the, you know, the processes in place to support that person to do better, but you get to the point where it's not working. And I think there, you know, our system in the UK Civil Service for performance management is very detailed, and it's all about fairness. So you then, you know, really get into the detail of what someone does of a day, support them in task management, you know, start the week saying this is what we're going to do, end the week of how did you do it. There's a very detailed performance management process once you get to that point. And then ultimately, you know, if you've really invested, you've taken the time to give the feedback, you've thought about where your organisation can go for that person, if you get to the point where you both decide it's not working, then maybe that place isn't for you. But I really believe you have to exhaust everything before you get to that point, because you could lose some amazing talent just because your cultures aren't necessarily fitting. And I think you have to invest in a real process of performance management. Again, it's that bit about infrastructure.
Yep.
The infrastructure under the KPI or the message is so important. And I'm really lucky that the UK Civil Service does that and takes it quite seriously.
I'm actually quite surprised to learn that there is a performance appraisal system in the civil service.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, we work to deliver for the UK taxpayer, and the UK taxpayer expects there to be a high level of performance, and that just, you know, you need a structure to deliver that. And performance management and delivery is core to what we do. So we need a good system.
Great.
I think that something that you touched on earlier about how, you know, in certainly the generation of people who are in their 40s and around that, we have this gratitude for people who care about us, like from our bosses or whatever, people who are above us in our line of work, kind of caring about, like, how are you doing really? Like, you're doing this is, and this in your workplace, but, you know, how are you actually really? But I have noticed that in this new generation that's entered the workforce, which is for us, we have a business where we have mostly a younger generation. And there is a perception that happiness in the workplace should be generated from the head, from us, and I think we do a pretty good job of that. But I also feel that there is at some point a necessity for the individual to take ownership of their own happiness. Have you found that the case is it just in Mauritius, or do you think it's in the UK as well?
No, I mean, I'd refer again to the UK, because we've been having this really interesting conversation about intergenerational diversity. And, you know, at the moment there are 4 generations in the workplace. There are the boomers, there's Gen X, I think we're all Gen X, there's the millennials, and then increasingly there's Gen Z. And these generations, you know, in their professional selves are butting heads. There's no doubt about it. You know, what I expect and what I think in terms of performance and delivery and behaviour at work is quite different, I think, to the boomer generation, which was much more formal than Gen X. But it's even, you know, it's different to the millennials and Gen Z. So I think, Shannon, this is such an important conversation and no one has an answer to it. And I went on various TED Talks and YouTube to try and understand it, and I'm still none the wiser. And I think I absolutely agree with you, because, you know, being at work, it's a two-way process. It's a contract, and a contract requires two people. So as an employer, absolutely, it is our responsibility to provide the right enabling environment where people feel valued, where they have the right tools to be their best professional self and do what they need to. But then as an employee, you have a responsibility as well, not just kind of turn up and wait to be sort of entertained, but, you know, to do the job to the best of your ability and to be part of your line management experience. You know, to give views, to think about, this is how we could do better in my role, but this is how the company could do better. It's an exchange. It's two ways. And I think we have a communication problem between the generations, without a doubt. What I like to, you know, I've felt uncomfortable at times because I have a very particular way of seeing the workplace, and I'm quite a strong believer in bringing my professional self to work. You know, I think when people talk about bring yourself to work, I think most of our employers don't mean your totally real self, you know, because I think they mean your professional self. And I think there has to be a conversation in your team or in your institution about what is your professional self and what are the professional values we want in our workplace? What's the professional culture? And then take it from there. And I think it also comes down to individuals as well. So some of the feedback I've had as a line manager is that I'm quite uptight and that I don't talk about myself enough. But as an individual, I don't want to talk. I'm quite a private person. I don't want to come in and tell you all about, like, the evening I had, because that's my evening. That's private to me. But I have to take the feedback. I'm hitting the mic, sorry. I have to take that feedback and think about, what do I need to adjust to that to make my colleagues and also the people that I line manage more comfortable. So you have to listen to feedback, but at the same time you have to sort of respect that people are people as well. And it is about bringing your professional self to work. I'm not sure about your whole self, but...
Yeah. No, I totally get that. The other day I was interviewing someone and she was going on about how, you know, her previous employer was this and that, and she just quit. I was like, well, did you actually voice out, you know, communicate what you were anxious about or unhappy about? She said no. I just, you know, decided to quit. And what you said resonated a lot with me because I think communication is vital. And so it's not just down to the employee having to second guess what the employees are thinking, but also the employees have to
Absolutely.
own their happiness.
Absolutely. In the civil service, some of our core values include confidence and empowerment. I think there's something, so we have sessions in the High Commission where we talk about our culture. And what we're saying is that it's not about management or leadership imposing a culture. There are things we absolutely expect in terms of standards and delivery, absolutely. But, sort of things like respect, things like well-being, they require input from absolutely everybody. And feel empowered to say what you think, feel empowered to engage in those conversations. Because I do get frustrated when, in the past, in other teams I've worked in other countries, it's like, well, what will you do for me? And I instantly say, well, what are you going to do for us? Go beyond this sense of the individual and towards a sense of collective, but also feel comfortable that you can say what you think. I think that's really important.
Because what's the point of keeping it inside, building up, and then you've quit or you've moved on and then you talk about it and you haven't resolved anything?
No.
Whereas I think giving them the opportunity to address your concerns when, in the right time, I think that's super important.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So how would you personally define happiness in the workplace?
Oh, God. Wow.
For you?
For me, this is for me, I think, absolutely. I don't think you necessarily, sort of always have to absolutely 110%, feel, I don't know, as, in your soul relating to what you do, but you have to find it interesting and motivational. And I come from, sort of a generation, I think Gen X is quite driven by sort of social justice and sort of values, and it's quite values driven. And so, doing something that helps is important to me. So I think that's really important. I think respect is really, really important to happiness. I think you have to feel like your contribution is being respected, your views are being respected, you're being respected. I think that's really important to happiness at work. I think having a time for formality and having a time for informality is really important. The one thing I really missed during COVID, because we had quite a tight lockdown in the UK, where many of us were back working at home for sort of like months on end. I missed office camaraderie. I really did. That ability to just stop, go and have a cup of tea with someone, have a giggle with someone, look over your monitor, when you're both in a meeting, like, what is going on? Just that human interaction and camaraderie is so important at work. And like I said, there's absolutely a time for your professional self and being formal, but there's also a time to be able to just relax with your colleagues and kick back a little bit and have a bit of a giggle. So I think for me, doing something motivational that adds value is important. Feeling respected at work is important to my personal happiness, but also enjoying being with my colleagues is really important as well.
Yeah.
You mentioned professional self, and
Yeah.
you've mentioned it a couple of times. It's a very interesting concept.
Yeah.
Do you ever feel that it clashes sometimes with your inner self, your true self? For example, I mean, you're a British High Commissioner. How do you navigate around the bureaucracy? Sometimes you're not always in line, maybe with every decision and policy that's been taken. How do you navigate around those and still be your professional self?
So ultimately I'm a British civil servant, and we work to a very clear code in the civil service. And I massively believe in that. That's why I do this job. I believe in public service, and I believe in working to the civil service code. So, as an individual, of course I have my viewpoints, but ultimately the job that I do, decisions are taken by ministers, and they've been elected by the British public. So I respect that. At the same time, within the civil service, there's a culture that's really encouraged of giving your viewpoint, of feeling empowered to be able to say what you think. And, you know, a really important part of being a civil servant and the relationship that you have with your elected ministers is giving good quality, evidence-based, impartial advice. And I feel I can do that. I can give my viewpoint as long as I've got the evidence and the data to support that, because you can't just say what you think without having evidence. I think I have a supportive institution and environment to do that, to give what I think that, you know, the viewpoints that I have. But ultimately, you know, it is ministers who take those decisions, and I respect that because they've been elected by the people who pay my salary, which is the UK taxpayer. Yeah. So yeah, of course I've got views on different things, but this is my profession and I respect it.
The other day, Charlotte, we saw you at the Anzac celebration in the morning. It was very early, 7 a.m. And then the next day we saw you again, bright and smiling, but it was an evening function. It was the one in Mauritius. It was the ASR function.
Yes.
And again, you were there, very dynamic. So you're pretty much everywhere and smiling all the time, looking very sharp, looking the part. How do you do it?
Oh, wow. Well, that is a very kind sort of characterisation of me, because I'm not sure I'm always looking together. It's my job, you know. I have to be constructive. I have to be positive. I have to be engaging with people. That's the job. And I think, I mean, personally, the way you know, for me, and I think having a family and being a working parent has been really helpful to that, is I am hyper organised. I am organised within a minute of my life. And I've done that purposefully because I think if I want to be able to have good quality time with my children, I've got to put the investment into making sure that my time is managed well, because it's so important for me to be able to, you know, to still be, to be a working parent and still be able to raise my kids. But to do that, my time has to be, you know, I have to manage my time really well. And I think, you know, to be able to sort of do the external representation work that I do, time management is absolutely critical to that. But also I've just got an amazing team. You know, I rely so much on my team. You know, I mean, I sound really kind of, I'm slightly biased, but I think they're one of the best teams I've ever worked with. And you have to sort of think about, you know, what do you delegate? What does someone else do? Do they have the skills that, you know, that's better than you to do that? You just have to think about the resource that you have. And I can't do everything. And I have to have sort of like respect and faith and, you know, sort of, you know, and trust in my team that they can do certain things. So I think effective delegation and using the team resource that you have is also really important to balancing everything. So I think you know, it's a long way of saying really good organisation and time management. You know, sort of trusting my team and knowing when to get others to do something rather than for me to do it. But just, you know, sort of at the same time, just always, I feel a really strong sense that I'm absolutely privileged and lucky to do this job. It's a great job. And, you know, sort of that feeling of privilege helps motivate me. I'm really, really lucky to be the British High Commissioner in Mauritius. So part of the smile on my face is because I can't believe my luck.
Oh, that's
I love
great.
that.
Really, really good. In fact, being organized, and you associate that to, you know, a sense of pride and a sense of happiness and enjoyment in the work. A lot of people would say this is not the cliche. You know, the cliche happy person would be someone who just goes with the flow, wings it, doesn't organize anything, and just, you know, carpe diem. But you're giving us a different sense of what it takes to be happy.
I think if you're able to always wing it, you're really lucky. For me, you know, ever since I was, you know, sort of taking my GCSEs or whatever, it's been about preparation and organisation. I can't wing stuff. I think it's impossible for me. But that's just me. I know plenty of people who I work with who wing stuff. But I think for me, preparation is a big part of this job. You know, for me to go to an event, I like to know who's there, because I think it's important in relationship building to understand who you're meeting, to ask them, you know, to sort of know a bit about their background. I think that demonstrates respect as well, that you've done your homework and you're going to something not just to have the free booze, but to actually engage and sort of establish relationships with people. I think the other thing I should also say about sort of balancing in this job, I think it's also, I think an important skill to have is to know when something should be perfect and to know when something is good enough. You know, that the job is so busy, everything can't be perfect. Some things have to be, absolutely, but you've also got to know when it, you know, sort of, I think perfection should not be the enemy of the good. And I'm a strong believer in that as well. But yeah, I think going back to your original question, Rishi, on winging it, I can't do that. It's just not in me. And I think those who can, more power to them, and I'm so jealous of them.
Can I just say, you come across as someone who does it so well, naturally, and you
Could I
just
record you saying that,
Yes.
please?
No,
I
but
play it to myself every morning.
but you totally are. And
That's really
on
kind.
that note, we
Yeah.
would like to
Thank
thank
you.
you so
No,
much.
thank you for the. I think it's been so. We don't often in our schedules take time to think about these issues, but it's both the right thing to do because we're all humans at the end of the day, but I think it's also from a business perspective, it's absolutely the right thing to do because it's how you get people working really well and being the best of themselves at work. So thank you for the opportunity to take a bit of time to reflect on it. Thank you.
Oh, our pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.